That's right, yes. We're all working together to sort of build a picture on social media, fire off each other, so that it gains a bit more momentum, that we're sending out the same kinds of messages.
So first and foremost, let's make this distinction between an invasive species and a non-native.
Yes, there are lots of species which would be considered non-native, but they're not all invasive. So what is an invasive species? I guess it's something that is not only not native and natural to the island itself, but is damaging in some way to our interests. So it might damage economic interests in some way. It's damaging to housing or something like that. Or it could be that it's damaging to the ecology in some way. It overshades and outcompetes other native plants and changes the ecology of a habitat.
So what are kind of the biggest culprits really on the Isle of Man that are a bit nasty to the natural world over here?
Oh, there's a number of species that have gained a hold over here. I suppose the most well-known one is the one that we can't speak the name of anyway, which is the RAT, which of course is a huge economic effect every year. If you think of the amount of money that's spent on dealing with that, that's been here the last couple of 100 years.
I suppose it's one that gets overlooked actually.
Yeah, because we're so used to it now that we just think it's part of the
Part of the
natural
Manx
world out
furniture,
there,
yeah.
but 200 years ago it wasn't. And there was another species, the black species, was there, the ship RAT, that went extinct when the brown one came in. And then we've got the house mouse, a similar issue.
So it's not just, I suppose, mammals and fauna, so to speak. That I think flora play a real role in this. And I can think of one, Japanese knotweed's a real issue.
That's the most well-known one, yes, and the damage is well renowned for that one. And there are other species. There's quite a few species which are moved around through pond plants, for instance, crassula, which can grow from tiny little short pieces and can form a mat which just completely crowds and shades out everything else in a pond. It can completely cover it. And it's very hard to remove because it takes just tiny pieces to gain a foothold. So anybody moving around pond plants, bucket full of stuff, needs to be very, very careful that they don't have some of the more noxious of them, parrot's feather. There's a whole series of these, and there's a code called Be Plant Wise, which just encourages people to be particularly careful about these things, because it takes one person to be a bit negligent on these things, and it can be years of strife wherever it goes, because crassula in particular is now impossible to get rid of, and we've got it in ponds here. I heard it's in one of the reservoirs now, and very, very difficult to get rid of. So if it doesn't get there in the first place, not a problem, but as soon as it's there...
Well, you're talking about prevention then. Well, how much of the geographical feature of the Isle of Man, the island nature of it, how much does that act as a defence mechanism, if at all?
That's a tricky one to answer. The systems that we have can be a contributor to the issue, I think, to turn it on its head in a way, in that, so you mentioned Japanese knotweed, so that all came from one plant in the British Isles originally. So how's it got around? Well, people have moved it between gardens and such like, and then it's got onto riverbanks. Now, when it's got onto riverbanks, there's a natural erosive effect. Rivers naturally weave around and move. And when they do, they'll take little pieces of roots down with them. And you can end up with the whole riverbank all the way downstream from the original spot being coated with Japanese knotweed for a few metres either side, crowding out competing all the other species. And we see that happening on a number of rivers on the island, for instance, doing the Glass here down into Douglas. And it's a constant job of work then to try and remove it. And it really requires coordinated action for that kind of a species, because whereas you can take it out in a certain site that you've got responsibility for, if it's still further upstream, you're fighting a bit of a losing battle, really. So people need to join together and say, right, top down, we need to take this plant out if it's causing a problem.
So where is the department sort of focusing most of its energy then in terms of the biggest culprits? Is it Japanese knotweed?
Well, first of all, there's what occurs on our own estate, and obviously that's key important to us because it's essentially a landowner's responsibility in legal terms. So as a landowner, the department has responsibility for a very large estate, includes the uplands, includes the glens, plantations, and so there are species which turn up in these places that we need to be very cognizant of. So as well as Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam, another riverside plant which causes issues. There's things like rhododendron that we're just starting to get into now, because whilst Rhododendron ponticum, the common purple-flowered rhododendron, it is quite commonly planted here. It hasn't become a massive issue, but we know that it can, and I suspect that it will if we give it half a chance, because sometimes these things take a while to settle fully in, and then there's maybe some slightly genetic change, and they manage to really take off. They get to a certain population size, for instance, and we've seen that happen in places like Snowdonia, where the thousands of pounds a year are spent on trying to remove it with volunteers and with people coming in with chainsaws and pesticides and yeah.
Well, very much a remnant, I suppose, of sort of a colonial attitude of the British Empire spreading around the world and bringing back some of the prized plants from various parts of the empire. What is the problem with rhododendron? It's a rather attractive plant for the garden, isn't it?
It is beautiful, and there are many hundreds of other beautiful rhododendrons that aren't invasive, and that's where we need to draw the line. We need to decide what is an issue. For us, it may be different in another part of the world, in a different ecology with different species. But for us, some certain species are an issue, and in fact, some are more commonly an issue everywhere, and there's a list of the 100 most invasive, problematic species in the world that people can go and have a look at. So there are lots of rhododendrons which we could plant and are relatively safe because they won't tend to spread themselves around, whereas this particular one we know can be a problem in the British Isles in our climate that we have here. And so we don't want to take that risk that we could spend forevermore spending all of our available funds and time and effort in trying to control something which we didn't need to do, when we could be doing something really positive with that resource.
So you talk about managing your own estate as well, but you touched on earlier about third sector involvement as well. How valuable is that in combating native species, non-native species and invasive species?
It is a great value, and it'll be very interesting to see how things move ahead with the new Friends of the Neb, which has been set up by Roger Banks-Jones and Patrick, who's very keen to see volunteer effort provide a coordinated response to the issue on the Neb with Japanese knotweed and Himalayan balsam. So on the relatively simple side, the Himalayan balsam, it's a case of people recognising what that plant is, knowing where the issues are, and with the landowner's permission, obviously, going in and pulling the plant with the roots and removing it in that way. It's a relatively simple job. The Japanese knotweed is more of an issue because that's a matter of using herbicides, and obviously people have to be properly trained to use things safely and do it properly, safe for the environment, safe for themselves, safe for the people. But there still is potential in that, and the department's quite happy to support that volunteer group in undertaking such action. And obviously if that's really successful, it'd be nice to see that replicated.